Interest rates are raised to fight inflation, taxes are increased to save the budget, and then the same people act surprised when the economy stalls. The absurd part is that everyone pretends this is neutral economic policy, while in reality, it's just the front line of a political war between elite groups. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the channel. The core conflict is simple. What is sold to the public as macroeconomic management is, in practice, a struggle for survival between rival clans. In Russia, that's especially visible, but the logic is not uniquely Russian. You see similar patterns in the US, in the EU, and around the whole post-Cold War financial system. And when policy turns into weaponry, real sectors of the economy get starved so that certain groups can keep their chairs. By the end of this video, you'll see why the current economic downturn is not an accident, why some people are deliberately tightening the screws, and why the bill is paid by those who don't sit in ministries or on corporate boards. Let's start from the ground, not from speeches. In Russia today, there is a fast economic decline. You don't need government statistics to see it. You look at freight volumes, electricity consumption, investment plans quietly frozen, and you understand the system is being put on an oxygen diet. Liquidity is pulled out, credit is strangled, and then officials say, strange, growth is weak. Here is where the story stops making sense. If you really wanted growth, you wouldn't simultaneously raise interest rates sharply and prepare a heavy tax squeeze. Yet that is exactly what we see. A deliberate rate hike that makes long-term investment unprofitable, followed by a second wave in the form of higher taxes that depress demand and margins. Officially, this is about fighting inflation and stabilizing the budget. In real numbers, it looks much more like escalation in a political fight. One group cutting off the air supply to another. To understand why, you have to look at the players, not just the instruments. Inside the Russian system, there are two broad camps. On one side are the monetary and budgetary authorities, the central bank, the finance ministry, the liberal technocratic bloc. On the other side is what we can call the patriotic camp, part of the government, part of the security and industrial structures, plus the rest of the country that tries to actually produce something. Everyone is supposed to believe this is just professional disagreement about the right interest rate. The system, however, is built around a much harsher reality. Both groups understand that if they lose, they don't just retire politely. They lose access to flows, assets, and in some cases, personal safety. This is the part no politician wants to explain on TV. When the central bank raises the key rate into the face of falling investment, it is not just protecting the currency, it is also saying to the rest of the elite, without us, your growth will not exist. If organized growth had continued on the basis of cheaper credit and industrial planning, the obvious question would appear, why do we need this old liberal bloc at all? If you remember only one thing from this video, let it be this. When economic tools contradict basic textbook logic, you are not watching economics anymore. You are watching internal warfare with financial instruments. Now, before someone says this is uniquely Russian, let's widen the frame a bit. The post-1980 Western order was built by the financial class on a very simple strategy: break large industrial blocks, privatize their assets, securitize everything, and print layers of claims on top. That is exactly how the collapse of the USSR and the shock therapy of the 1990s were used, as a giant collateral pile for the global financial system. The logic was clear: carve up the territory, sell assets cheap, issue new paper on top, and become so rich and dominant that nobody can touch you. You see the same mentality now around artificial intelligence. Major platforms are investing in infrastructure that no one else can afford to duplicate. The idea is the same. We will build something so huge and capital intensive that any competitor will be decades behind. Then we set the rules. Historically, every time someone tried to build a structure so big it cannot be challenged, it ended badly. Empires, cartels, super trusts, now AI giants. The pattern is boringly stable. Back to Russia. The liberal bloc there is connected in mentality and often in networks to this global financial logic. For them, normal life is not in Chelyabinsk or Novosibirsk. It is on the Riviera, in London, in Miami, at fashion weeks and conferences. The local economy is something you manage, not something you live in. The patriotic camp, in contrast, consists of people who know their children and grandchildren are going to live in that same country, under that same tax code and that same infrastructure. From your country, does this look like strategy or just improvisation with a flag on top? because the structure is recognizable far beyond Russia. Now, let's talk about how this internal war translates into concrete measures. First, interest rates. Every first-year economics student sees the basic picture. There is an approximate bell-shaped curve for tax revenues versus tax rates and a clear relationship between credit cost and investment. Past a certain point, raising rates and taxes doesn't bring in more money. It destroys activity and shrinks the base. There is one simple curve in every macro textbook that no minister likes to say out loud. We'll get to it in a second. For now, look at what is happening. Rates go up, planned tax increases are announced, and immediately we see talk of budget gaps, necessary borrowing, and difficult choices. This is not an accident. This is the mechanism. Here's that curve. Once you push taxes and interest rates beyond the peak of the Laffer-style relationship, each additional increase reduces inflows. Officially, you wanted more revenue. In practice, you squeeze the economy so hard that the state has to borrow more just to plug the holes created by its own policies. This is where the spreadsheet quietly turns into social unrest. For ordinary people, none of this is abstract. Higher rates mean more expensive mortgages and business loans, fewer jobs, slower wage growth. Higher taxes mean less money in the pocket, and for small businesses it can be the difference between break even and close the doors. At the same time, inflation in basic goods eats savings. You don't need a PhD to feel it. If you live in Germany or Poland, you probably recognize parts of this picture. Energy prices spike, the ECB tightens, businesses complain about credit, but the narrative is still about sustainable transition and structural reforms. And let's not forget the external battlefield. Western elites also know they are in a race. In the US, the AI bubble, leveraged financial markets, and a fragile social fabric create enormous risk. In the EU, deindustrialization, energy costs, and demographic decline slowly erode the base. In such a system, direct military adventures become dangerous because the home front is no longer safe. Take the discussion around Venezuela. On paper, the US could try a classic intervention. In reality, the cost of blowback is now much higher. The tools have changed. A single container ship in the Gulf of Mexico with a few hundred cheap drones inside is enough to put several coastal refineries out of action. Air defense around critical infrastructure inside the US is not built for that. Once drones are in the air, it is very hard to prove whether they came from a foreign state, a cartel, or some unknown actors. Here's where the story really stops making sense. You cannot run a 21st century empire with 20th century assumptions about invulnerability. American elites understand this on some level. That is why we see senior figures quietly moving their families onto military bases, where at least there is some air defense and perimeter security. They know the system they built abroad can be mirrored back onto them. For Europe, and especially for small states like those in the Baltics, this creates an awkward position. On the one hand, they are structurally dependent on Western financial and security structures. On the other, they are exposed to the consequences if those structures start to crack. Now, add Russian internal dynamics to this global turbulence. The liberal monetary bloc in Russia understands that an organized, investment-driven growth model would marginalize them. So instead of allowing the post-2022 reorientation to generate stable industrial expansion, they squeeze higher rates, tighter money, tax hikes. That slows growth, increases budget tension, and creates the narrative, without our discipline, everything will collapse. At the same time, the patriotic camp is far from angelic. It also contains its own internal factions, rival security and industrial groups, each with their own interests and loyalties. Part of them are still semi-liberal in practice, because for decades the main source of money flowed through the old financial bureaucratic networks, privatization, budget control, quasi-state corporations. If you remove the liberal bloc completely, competition does not disappear. The remaining camp immediately fragments. This is one of those iron laws of power. As soon as one coalition wins, internal contradictions come to the surface and new factions form. The idea that there will be some clean, unified, patriotic elite is fiction. So from the point of view of an ordinary citizen, what does all this elite drama actually change? First, it delays any serious cleanup of the 1990s legacy. Everyone talks about new privatizations from time to time, selling off state assets to improve efficiency, but society is not ready to accept another round while the crimes and distortions of the first wave have not been seriously reviewed. There is neither political will to do lustration of those who organized the original asset grab, nor capital available to pay fair prices. Foreign investors are limited by sanctions and political risk. Domestic capital is cautious. If something is sold now, it will be cheap and politically toxic. Second, It freezes honest discussion of long-term development strategies. As long as the central question is which clan wins, no one can admit the obvious. The current model of high rates, raw material dependence, and ad hoc borrowing is a dead end. Someone will need to change it, but any serious change immediately shifts the balance of power. So everything is delayed under technical language. Third, it imports external crises directly into domestic budgets. When Western markets inflate an AI bubble and then correct, or when energy prices swing because of geopolitics, states like Russia and the EU members feel it through capital flows, commodity prices, and exchange rates. The answer is always the same. We have to tighten belts. But belts are not tightened on those who designed the policies. If you work in energy or industry, you probably feel this earlier than others. You see demand volatility, delayed payments, frozen projects. You see how political decisions about sanctions, wars, alliances, and rate hikes hit your order book in 6 months, while the people who made those decisions talk about strategic patience. Let's bring this back to time horizons. In the original conversation this material is based on, there was an estimate. The current Russian configuration has maybe a year to a year and a half before it hits a harder wall. Budget gaps, high borrowing costs, and structural decline will converge. At the same time, the Western system is also heading towards its own stress points: an overloaded AI financial bubble, elections, social fatigue. Which side cracks first is not something we can predict precisely. What we can say is that none of the key players are managing their economies as if ordinary citizens were the priority. They are managing them as battlefields. This is the part no politician wants to explain on TV. When you see obviously destructive economic decisions defended with straight faces, assume you are not the intended beneficiary. In this sense, elites everywhere are in the same game. The difference is only in style. Some hide behind central bank independence and technical jargon. Some hide behind patriotic slogans and war rhetoric. Some hide behind green transitions and climate narratives. But the underlying structure is identical. Protect our positions, push the costs onto those who do not have a seat at the table. For people in Europe, in the Baltics, in Russia, in the US, the practical conclusions are unpleasant but necessary. Expect more volatility. Expect more experiments with your taxes, your savings, your bills. Expect that crises will be used not to correct models, but to reshuffle chairs. The main thesis is simple. What is sold as economic policy is, in fact, just one front of a broader elite conflict. Until that changes, you should treat every major fiscal and monetary move as a political act first and an economic decision second. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones, and try to remember, slogans don't power grids. Systems do.